Hello, beautiful, and welcome. So today I am here to talk about addiction, which is a really hard subject to talk about. What I'm here to do is simply share the truth of my life, what works for me and what doesn't work for me. This whole endeavor online for me is creating a safe space online for me to share the truth of my life and for everybody else. So no further ado, this is my addiction story and how I cope with life so that I have a mentally stable and healthy mind, body, soul, spirit, and I'm just feeling like I have a clear bubble most of the time. My very tangled story starts with 3 significant factors. I had an unstable home life that was emotionally and physically abusive. I had an unstable school life, which was also emotionally and physically abusive. And I was raped by a family member and didn't tell anybody for about 15 or so years until he started stalking me on Facebook. And then I was forced to tell my family, and it ended up totally changing my life for the better. Also in this mix, I was going through puberty, which also just, kicks everything up a notch in life. So basically I felt depressed already, as a 12-year-old girl generally does. And I ended up already feeling very suicidal, and I do believe I was ADD in school already to this point. I do feel it's important to note that my school life was unstable because it was a Catholic school. The emotional teachings really instilled shame and blame in the wrong places in life. I'm realizing that everything in life can be a tool if we choose to see it that way. Shame can be a tool that can be used for healthy and unhealthy reasons, and so can blame. Accountability is also the same thing. If you're trying to hold somebody accountable for something they didn't actually do, that's a negative thing. But if you're holding somebody accountable for something they really did, and you're doing it in equal intensity to the damage that they did to somebody else, then it's accountability in a very healthy way, because we should be held accountable for our actions. That's how we learn. There was also no respect at all for boundaries, and we weren't encouraged to talk about boundaries, to actually set boundaries, to enforce boundaries. And if we tried to set a boundary, it damn well was not respected in Catholic school. So in my family, sometimes there was physical abuse as well as verbal abuse, but there was also a lot of loving, intense things. Everything was very intense growing up, really, would be a good way to say it. I now see that I learned a lot of unhealthy coping mechanisms. So I was around work addiction and drug addiction within my own family. There was also a across-the-board denial of any abuse or any wrongdoing at all. No adults were ever held accountable. Children were also held accountable for things that they shouldn't have been held accountable for. In my home life and in my school life, I see that I didn't have actual roles for what is right and what is wrong. It's kind of the idea of parents not realizing that kids really just follow what you do. They don't do what you say. It doesn't matter what you say. It matters what you do, and they learn from example more than anything else. So, of course, I picked up addictive behaviors from my family. And in our family, we just had generation and generations of unhealthy coping mechanisms. So I had no stable place to talk about being raped. And when you go through such a significant thing, you really need a support system to help you through it. And if you can't talk about it and you just hold it inside, you kind of end up just wanting to kill yourself a lot. So that's basically what I did. And I felt really lost. Yeah, I also didn't have any friends. I had birds and a rabbit, and those were my friends. So I really just felt lost. Then my doctor decided to put me on Adderall, because It's really hard to pay attention in school when you're going through all of that, when you're like 12 and with hormones surging through your body. So I just felt really lost, and the doctors put me on more and more Adderall, and I ended up on the highest dose of Adderall that was legally allowed at the time, which I'm now told is illegal. I ended up really just giving up on life working, and I really had a break, and I became really, really suicidal. And that was when I started doing meth, because I sought out meth pretty much as a suicide wish, and I knew that a lot of people died when they were doing it, so I wanted to do it so I could die and stop reliving seeing him over me and waking up to him choking me and all of these things. It was really traumatic to lose my virginity that way, and I now know that when you're that young, from a mental standpoint, you really just have this PTSD, psychotic break type of thing that really is logical. Like, everything that happened to me makes complete sense. There's medical explanations for a lot of it, and I now am so grateful that I was able to piece this all together. So I then ended up quitting street drugs when I went to a fancy rehab, because one of the things that I was really not appreciative of at the time, but I am now really grateful for after being homeless, was I was really privileged. And we were millionaires at the time. Like, my dad might live paycheck to paycheck now because of my MS and losing money and all, and we might be super tight, but like, my God, I still have a roof over my head and I'm not homeless. Being homeless sucks, and my heart goes out to anybody that's homeless. And I really see how poor people are treated very differently, and how when I got a meth habit, I was carted off to a fancy rehab. I was literally a patient along rock stars and beauty queens and all of this stuff. And it's really crazy to me how a poor person, if I was poor and black and doing the exact same things, I probably would have just gone to jail and died. But because I was given a chance to at least try to get better, although what the medical establishment at the forefront was doing was wrong, it still was something that was better than what was being done to poor people. Throwing people in jail for getting raped by a family member and then getting on meth to be suicidal isn't going to help anybody. So getting sober from drugs really, it wasn't the stop of my addictions at all, now I see. It started in rehab, but I really didn't identify it until years later. But in the first few years of my addiction, it really just morphed into different things. I had eating issues with, literally in the last 17 years, I've had issues with overeating, undereating, throwing my food up. I've ate cotton balls. I've taken laxatives. I have severely overeaten to the point that I just vomit without even trying to vomit, like bulimically, but just like gorging myself to the point that my stomach gives up. Then I did cutting. I've done multiple types of self-mutilation. I've done multiple suicide attempts, including stabbing myself, and 2 overdoses, one that did result in death that I was resuscitated from. There's just a whole bunch of clusterfucky things that happened, and I don't want to focus on the details of all the bad things, but I guess because of how I seem now, I know that I'm so completely worlds away from who the fuck I was back then. So I see that I should share the truth, because looks are deceiving, and yeah, I had a really big problem, and I was really fucking crazy, and I I got away with so much because of how I look. And I see how that was not necessarily helpful to me either by giving me so much privilege. I think when we're all more equal, it really gives everybody a mental privilege. I also would consider part of my addictions abusive relationships. I really could have been addicted to anything. I was the issue all along. The drugs weren't the issue. The food wasn't the issue. Food was really how I had to learn how to cope, because you can't just quit food. You can't just quit having eating problems. You have to actually learn how to manage it. With drugs, they actually just removing drugs from your life will fix things. That was absolutely 100% not going to bring me mental stability. I now see as well that I never really got the drugs out of my system until I was about 18, 19, because I immediately, upon being put in rehab, when I was detoxing, was immediately put on pharmaceutical medications. So I never had a period of true detox from all medications until years after I was actually in sobriety. I see how my brain really never had a chance to learn how to cope because SSRIs don't work. And in my research, I've found that the companies that sell them know they don't work, and they have done a lot of work to hide that data from doctors and patients. But Freedom of Information Act requests can end up getting upheld, and you can end up learning a whole lot about some evil people that made a lot of money off of all of us dying. I was on pharmaceutical drugs a whole lot longer than I was ever on street drugs. I only used street drugs for like a year or so, but I was on pharmaceutical drugs for years, like 3 years maybe, straight every day. And I had way more side effects that were weird ones. Like I remember one side effect was my nipples, like leaking pussy, milky, and blood stuff. And I thought I was like dying. And it was actually a side effect from a fucking medication that I didn't need to take because it didn't actually work. So over the years, I've gone through all of these challenges, and I've gone through the suicidal tendencies and all these different emotions. Now it's the part of the video where I share with you what is addiction to me. I've read research, I've read all sorts of different things, from blog posts to Medium stories to books written by academics to books written by other addicts. One thing that I see is that addiction is really different to everybody, and we all have a unique story for that reason as well. I think it's so unique, and that's one reason I want to learn about different people's experiences with it, and then I want to learn more about what is the actual majority. For instance, when Vietnam happened, a lot of Vietnam vets were actually addicted to heroin when they were in Vietnam because it was cheap and it was a depressing place to be. And when they came back, 75% of them got sober. But it was that small percentage that had a more challenging time getting sober. And they've looked at the differences in what did these people have. They had supportive environments that weren't abusive, that continued the abuse. They had people in their lives that they could actually talk to tangibly about their problems in a supportive way that would be honest with them. And they wouldn't be bullshitting, and they wouldn't be condemning them and shaming them either. They had a balance that was in a healthy direction, and also the person was motivated to get off of the drug and start a different life, and they just went back to doing the things that made them happy if it was attainable. The people that ended up having a harder time getting sober are the people that are more traumatized, the people that aren't dealing with it, that don't have a good structure at home to support them emotionally. And these things, environmental, emotional, and physical factors, all come together. It's not just one thing. And I see that it's just this unique combination for everybody. And to me, my journey since finding out about mental health is really just an adventure. I try to look at it as it's just an adventure of trying to find new ways to cope with life that are healthier and progressing within that every day. And I see that there are a lot of positive and negatives that I can take from everything in life. There's so much duality, and everything can be a tool. Everything can be coped with better. And I didn't have to be so bogged down and hurt by my reality. There were ways to cope with being raped as a child. I just didn't know what they were, and I wasn't in an environment that I was able to get that information until I was older, because my parents had never had to cope with something like that. And they grew up in abusive environments themselves that didn't give them the skills to cope with something anywhere near that difficult. So it's really about having empathy for them as well, because of course they wanted to help me and they didn't want to contribute to my pain more. They wanted to be healthy as well. And we all have a hard time seeing the truth of how dirty our bubble is. So when you look at bubble theory, I saw how when we're all traumatized in life, we end up losing our ability to focus. So to me, addiction is not a disease, and I haven't seen it like that for a long time. And changing that one thing in my mind has changed my life for the better. When I believed that addiction was a disease, it did not make my life better. It did not make my mental health better. And I now see through research that that entire model is really built for the medical field to have an easier job. I see that there's also a lot of money to be made by rehabs. I see how they were a stepping stone for me, but they weren't a be-all end-all for me. And they taught me a lot of things that really weren't helpful to me, and they continued to drug me instead of actually getting me detoxed. And I someday hope to have the courage to go there and talk to them about what is actually healthy. But I totally see that my parents spent a shit ton of money to have me drugged continuously after doing drugs myself, and to also learn things that weren't going to help me. Of course, that was the best that this country had to offer at the time, which is also very sad, because money, greed always has come before life in this country. Since the settlers came here, they have prioritized greed above life for all. And that's just how our country was founded. And now as I see that, I can understand mentally why we're so in a cognitive dissonant state, because we're not admitting the truth of who we are. We're not admitting the truth of ourselves as individuals or ourselves as a collective. Our collective is actually really important, because when the collective is sick, the individuals are sick. And it just means that enough of them have become sick that it's becoming a collective issue. So I think we really need to admit, just like I needed to admit I didn't know what I was talking about, and this country doesn't know what it's talking about when it comes to addiction. And I was told in my addiction, in rehab, and in therapy at that time was wrong. A huge part of that is because at that time, Therapists, for some reason, didn't think kids were capable of getting PTSD, something about our brains not being smart enough or capable enough of having PTSD. Lo and behold, that look at life is completely wrong. And whoever said that was probably somebody unwilling to look at their own childhood trauma, because childhood trauma actually translates more to mental health issues. And it has to do with that being the foundation of when our minds are created. It's when our personalities are formed and our brains are growing. And having disruption of those processes is really dangerous for the healthy human experience. I think the real solid nail in the coffin, though, for my changes in addiction mentality is getting MS, because the first few years... So basically, I was hit on the head with the air conditioner, and then I spent a few years just being a wallowy person that was depressed. Then I met this guy that made me feel special, and then he ended up dating me for 7 months and bashing my head in so many times that he gave me an unknown amount of concussions. I made a video about him if you'd like to see that. So I went from being basically like on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being like you're on a breathing tube about to die. I was like a 3 to 4. And then when he beat me up that last time, I ended up being a solid 7 to 8 these days. And I have had periods of time being completely bedridden out of pain. And I finally was able to admit to myself I was continuing to abuse myself by not going to the doctor and not taking medication. And part of it was the instilled fear from AA and NA, which I've been to both AA, NA, Overeaters Anonymous, Al-Anon. I've been to all of the programs that I possibly can, and they all have similar vibes, but in different ways. It wasn't a place that was healthy for me, and the last meeting I went to was actually to support a friend, but the last time during my time of like regularly going was the day before I turned 18, because a bunch of guys basically insinuated that now they could legally rape me and not go to jail for as long as they would have. When I started to admit to myself that I was not seeking out medical help because I felt like I deserved to be in pain. I felt like I was stupid to date somebody like that, and that I deserved to get MS because of it, and I should just deal with the pain. And it was one of my doctors that said, do you think that maybe you're still abusing yourself by not taking medication? And then I realized that I was 100% continuing to abuse myself by choosing to not take the medications that I needed to get out of bed, because the amount of pain that I feel is worse than actually dying. I have literally died and come back to life, and that was less painful than the most painful days with this disease. I mean, there's days where I have felt like I was being burned alive for days at a time. And if you were actually being burned alive, you wouldn't live for 6 days. You would end up dying before it got to 6 days. And that was really excruciating. I mean, and by that time, it had already been years where I didn't see addiction as a disease. So I really didn't feel like I was in that brainwashing mentality of thinking I had a disease that I didn't have, that I had no control over. But let me tell you, MS is a disease. And it's a disease that I have very little control over. And the only thing that I really do have control over is my mind and my ability to mentally cope with whatever my body has decided to do that day. While my addiction was not a choice, my addiction was also not a disease. And just because our culture only gives us those two options at that time doesn't mean that those are the only two possible truths. So I really now believe in the habit model of addiction, which looks at addiction as a habit that is formed, and I specifically see it as a coping mechanism that is unhealthy, that is used habitually. So we're attempting to use an unhealthy coping mechanism habitually, and it won't work because it's an unhealthy coping mechanism. If we want to have a healthy result, we have to find healthy coping mechanisms for us. That means finding the right drugs and finding the right circumstances for when you need drugs. And I really see now how what I focus on for my own mental health is staying mentally centered. So I am always reorienting and asking myself, am I centered? Like during the making of this video, I have meditated so much and taken many deep breaths because I'll get nervous. And I'll have a moment where I'm like, is somebody gonna attack me because I said that? And should I say it this way because that person attacked me that one time because I said it that way, and I should say it a different way, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm just like, no, Jessica, no. If somebody attacks you simply because you're sharing the truth of what works for you, they're attacking you because they're taking it personally and they're not really listening to my whole message. So if people attack you, they're attacking you out of their own turmoil, their own issues. And I can have empathy for that. Like, I totally have empathy for the fact that my ex was beating me up because he had a lot of mental issues. But I also have empathy for my brain, and I don't have to feel so bad for him that I think it's okay for him to do that. I now love myself more than I feel bad for him or any other person that has a sad story like that, because we all have challenges in life, but only a few of us end up thinking it's okay to beat each other up because we're having a bad day. Thinking that that's okay is a weakness. If you think it's okay to put others down, that's your own mental weakness. And it just sucks to be one of those people being put down. And I'm like so tired of it. But like, damn, so many people are dying from addiction. So just like, so realize, for me, addiction isn't a disease. And when I let go of that belief, it made my life better. It made my mind more free. When I started loving myself more than I felt bad for other people, that helped me. And there's a lot of things about AA that don't work for people like me because, for instance, empowerment was what I needed. I did not need to feel more powerless, especially when I was in the room with a bunch of fucking male predators that were sitting there thinking about raping me. The last thing that I needed was somebody telling me to feel more powerless, because the reason that I was doing drugs in the first place was I was powerless. But I understand that AA and NA, well, AA was founded by white men that were using drugs, and they probably did have entitlement issues, because white men have entitlement issues for the most part more than anybody else I've ever met in my life. Rich white men are the most entitled people because that's how society has built them to be. Society has told them they're entitled to things, and sometimes they figure out they're not, and they get pretty pissed about it, and they start attacking other people. You see the truth of somebody when they don't get what they want. Whenever your day doesn't go the way that you want it to go, whenever you are down and out, when somebody knocks you down, that's when you see who you really are. Like when I got knocked down, what did I do? I kept getting up. And I kept telling my truth. Even as my ex was beating me, I was saying the truth. It's wild. I literally don't know why or how I did that, but I did. So I see so many positives that came out of this whole journey. I learned so much in the last 17 years. I've met so many amazing people, and I've learned so much from them. Yeah, I've had a lot of negative situations that were really challenging, but now I see that challenges are just opportunities. Challenges are there for everybody, and I just learned a really unhealthy way of dealing with challenges, and I can turn that around. It was a matter of learning healthy ways to cope that worked for me. And now I just keep myself centered, and I focus on, okay, Jessica, what do you need right now? Like right now, my back is starting to spasm a lot because I've been sitting up for a long time. And I'm gonna need to take a muscle relaxer because it's spasming a lot more. And my spasms will get so intense. They're neuromuscular spasms. So it's the muscles that are attached to my bones and my nerves spasming, hitting my bones repeatedly. And my muscles will get so tight if I don't take a muscle relaxer that they tighten and they harden into muscle knots that I have to painfully get removed. Because the muscles are spasming so much that they like toughen up. It's excruciating. And the more I sit in a certain position for a length of time without stretching, the worse they get. So I'm just gonna start stretching a little so that I can help my spasms, because I see that I can minimize the effects of things with other things. Like yoga is a really healthy way of dealing with a lot of my health issues. So that way I take less pain medication. I also got a medical marijuana card in Pennsylvania, and since then I have been eating so much more and vomiting so much less. It's really awesome. Like, I was in so much pain that I literally could not eat without vomiting until I started smoking weed or taking medications. And I lost so much weight while I was bedridden. It was insane. Because I just could not keep food down. Because I would vomit when I thought about my ex. I would vomit when I saw my injuries. I would vomit when I felt pain, which led to a lot of vomiting. And my muscles were super atrophied. Now I'm working on gaining my muscle back. And I'm really just focused on health and being an overall centered and balanced person that is doing the things for my health that I need. And my health's really complicated, so I need a lot. And I take, on purpose, I take non-narcotic medications, which, to be honest, I'm kind of worried that one of them is more dangerous than narcotic medications for me to take long term, which is kind of crazy. Because pharmaceutical drugs, I found out a lot of pharmaceutical drugs aren't even tested on women because they have this stupid loophole where they say that they shouldn't have to test it on men and women. And their reasoning is because it's cheaper to test it on men because men don't have the hormone changes that women have. But then they say that those hormone changes don't really affect women that much, but then they don't actually test to see if it does. So how would they know? And also, a lot of medications aren't effective. Like, I've been looking up how many antidepressant medications literally don't work at all. There's very little evidence that they work. In fact, placebos work better. Literally I loved the one guy in one of the books I was reading said that going out into nature for like 20 to 30 minutes a day is so effective that if there was ever an antidepressant that had such results, it would be the #1 selling antidepressant. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. I get it. And it's true. I actually am on an antidepressant now, and the reason it makes me happy is because it makes me feel like I'm not being electrocuted. Yes. Which makes me very happy. I'm very happy when I don't feel like I'm constantly being electrocuted all day long. In fact, sometimes I forget that I used to feel that because I'm so good at letting shit go now that, like, even though for over a year I felt like I was being electrocuted almost on a daily basis at different levels of voltage, sometimes I forget that I even went through that because I just, like, don't hold on to shit anymore, which is amazing. As a person that was severely addicted to stuff and held on to, like, every little thing, I see it was really because I wasn't speaking the truth of the thing that was really bothering me. So everything else felt more important because I wasn't really talking about what I really wanted to talk about. So I kind of just talked about everything else. Like literally everything else. I used to talk so much before, but about very little substance. Now I talk a lot and it's substance, which honestly I think can be overwhelming for people. I think I'm pretty intense to people now more than ever because I'm like calm, but what I talk about is normally intense to other people because I'm so unaffected by these things now. And truly, I don't think about addiction. I don't think about going out and smoking some meth. I don't think about snorting drugs. I mean, I have a lot of issues, like my nose is still damaged from snorting drugs, which would be a great video in itself to like get a microscope up my nose to see, like, snorting drugs really fucks your nose up, and I highly advise not doing that if you want your nose to not be fucked up inside. And I have so many health repercussions from doing drugs. Honestly, I never thought I would survive. I wasn't doing drugs for recreational purposes. I was doing them for suicidal purposes when I switched to street drugs. The doctors taught me how to be an addict, and I hated it. By the time I was going to the street for drugs, I was seeking a death wish because I didn't know a way to cope, and everything that I was learning felt hopeless and stupid and not working, so I just felt like death was a better answer. That death was the only thing I could come up with. But since then, I feel a greater peace, a greater sense of fulfillment, a greater sense of love for myself first than I ever thought I could. And I see how strong I am in a very tangible, real way. And now I see that because of MS, I have to stay so much more mentally centered than most humans ever have to be. So it's pretty amazing how I've learned to grow and thrive after everything. I survived being raped. I survived the abuse. And now that I've changed my mindset, I have a chance to thrive. But also, like, I just am learning, like, I was working with a therapist that I just stopped working with recently because I was not really needing her, honestly. I went from being a total disheveled mess to really not needing my therapist. It was kind of incredible, actually, because I just know the work that I need to do, and the things that make me feel better are sharing the truth of my life. And I just wanted to work on getting my health to a point that I could get back into doing YouTube. So I'm in such a good mental place, and I just feel a responsibility to share because of that. Although during these 17 years, I've had so many times where I was so lost, so confused, so distraught. Actually, probably the majority of the last 17 years, to be more accurate, I felt like that. But man, the last few years when I got MS, something about getting MS just made me really hunker down and say to myself, okay, Jessica, I need to see the truth of my life and unload this baggage so I can deal with MS, because I can't live with this disease and also carry around this baggage. So I just decided, all right, let's unload this baggage and see how it goes. And for the first time, I really acknowledged things and acknowledged, why was I dating these people? Why was I feeling it was okay to be treated like that? And the truth is, we live in an abusive culture, and it goes way more than just a couple of people. There are thousands of people over my life that have treated me like a sex object, that have made me feel like that, and I started to believe them. And it's up to me to say, I don't care how many thousands of you tell me what you think I am. I know what I am. And I'm not just a sex object for you. I don't have to be a sex object just because a man or a woman wants me to be one. I cope with my addiction by seeing it as a symptom, because my addiction was really me trying to distract myself from my emotional problems. And I wanted to ignore my emotional problems because I didn't know how to cope with them. I didn't know how to talk about them, and I didn't have a safe space to talk about them, which is why I'm dedicated to starting a safe space online that we can all talk about these things. And we're in an abusive society, so we need to learn how to cope. And we can't expect animals to be able to cope like a robot, because at the end of the day, we're animals. Even though our ego wants us to be so much far above an animal, we're just animals that aren't very humble, which, if anything, makes us more animal than ever, because we don't want to acknowledge how vulnerable we are. But there's a lot of magic in that, so I highly recommend trying it. I hope that you got some benefit out of this video, and I hope that you have a good day where you're coping well with life and sharing the truth of your own life with those around you that you love, so that they can understand you better. And if you can't share it with them, share it with me. And I hope you have a beautiful day. Bye.